Phrasal verbs are one of the most confusing and frustrating aspects of learning English. But it doesn't have to be that way. In this lesson, I will first review what exactly a phrasal verb is, what types exist, and the necessary rules to use one in a sentence correctly. We will then discuss some wrong ideas that prevent English learners from successfully learning phrasal verbs. And finally, we will talk about the best way to learn phrasal verbs so you can actually remember them and use them in your daily conversations. In addition to all of this, I'm going to use 10 common phrasal verbs naturally throughout this video, so pay attention to how I use each of them in context. I've also created a free PDF worksheet for you to review all of the vocabulary from today's lesson. You can find the link in the description. Let's get started. A phrasal verb is a verb that is made of more than one word. The first word is a verb, and the word after the verb is called a particle. A particle can be a preposition or an adverb. Most phrasal verbs have only one particle, but sometimes a phrasal verb can have two particles. The important thing to remember is that the verb and the particle come together to create a new verb with a completely new meaning. For example, the verb put has a different meaning than the phrasal verb put on. We'll talk more about the meaning of this phrasal verb in a moment. Some require an object and others don't, but there are two types of phrasal verbs, separable and inseparable. Separable phrasal verbs allow you to separate the verb and the particle and put the object in the middle. An example of a separable phrasal verb is put on, which means to put something on your body or your face. So you can put on your shoes or you can put your shoes on. You can put on a nice shirt or you can put a nice shirt on.
I forgot to put on sunscreen.
However, with inseparable phrasal verbs, you have to keep the verb and the particle next to each other. And if an object is required, it must go at the end. An example of an inseparable phrasal verb is look back, which means to think about something that happened in the past. It's not possible to say, look it back or look something back. You can only look back. If you want to add an object, you can look back on something. Now, the problem is that it's impossible to look at a phrasal verb and know automatically if it's separable or inseparable. Sadly, there's no shortcut for this. Maybe you're asking yourself, why does it matter if the phrasal verb is separable or inseparable? If I have a choice to put the object in the middle or at the end, then I'll just put the object at the end of all phrasal verbs, right? No, sorry, because there's an important rule that you must know to use separable phrasal verbs correctly. If the object of a separable phrasal verb is a pronoun, then it must go in the middle. You can never put a pronoun at the end of a separable phrasal verb. Let's look again at the phrasal verb put on. You can say, I put my shoes on, and I put on my shoes. But look at what happens when we replace the object, my shoes, with the pronoun them. I put them on sounds fine, but I put on them? No, it doesn't work. And this is the case for every separable phrasal verb. This is why I recommend practicing by putting the object in the middle as much as possible, whether or not the object is a pronoun. So, how does conjugation work with phrasal verbs? Well, this is the easy part. It's basically the same as a normal verb, but you only conjugate the verb. The particle doesn't change. I looked back on my decision and realized I was wrong. I often look back on my college days because I really enjoyed that time in my life. Soon, I'll quit my job and I'll never look back. Remember that put is an irregular verb, so it looks similar in all tenses. I put on my jacket last night. He puts on his jacket every morning. Don't worry, I'll put it on when I go outside. Okay, now let's talk about 5 misconceptions that English learners have about learning phrasal verbs. Wait, what are misconceptions? Misconceptions are wrong ideas or false ideas that people have, usually because they don't completely understand the subject. Misconception number 1 is that phrasal verbs are either too casual or too formal. I've seen some comments online from English learners saying that phrasal verbs are not proper English, and that is simply false. This doesn't represent the majority of the ones that you see and hear every day. Sometimes if you try to replace a phrasal verb with a single verb, it sounds too formal or old-fashioned. I usually rise at 7 a.m. No, it sounds much more natural to say, I usually get up at 7 a.m. So get up and rise are definitely not used in the same situations. Also, sometimes the phrasal verb is the only option. I can't think of one single verb with exactly the same meaning as put on in modern English. Just to be clear, the verb wear is not the same as put on. Wearing something is a state or a result, and putting something on is an action. So right now I'm wearing glasses, but that's because earlier I put them on. Most phrasal verbs reflect normal, everyday speaking and writing, and you hear them everywhere. On the news, from your friends, your teacher, the president, etc. We use them all the time. That brings us to misconception number 2. It's an advanced topic, so I'll put off learning phrasal verbs until I'm at an advanced level. It's impossible to say, all right, we're done with phrasal verbs, let's go on to the next topic. It's not something that can be covered in one unit or one chapter of a textbook. Learning phrasal verbs is a lot like learning how to swim. The water will always be a little cold and you'll never feel completely prepared. But the only way to do it is to get in the water, feel uncomfortable for a little while, and then your body will gradually adapt to the temperature of the water. One day you'll look back and say, wow, why did I put this off for so long?
Yesterday, you said tomorrow, so just do it! Make your dreams come true!
Let's go on to misconception number 3. Each phrasal verb has only one meaning. Learning phrasal verbs is kind of like a Rubik's Cube. Every part of the cube represents a different arrangement of colors. Each person's perspective might focus on a different side of the cube. If you suddenly twist one row, your perspective can change again. The key to learning phrasal verbs is you need to open your mind and accept the fact that most words in general have multiple meanings, and all of those meanings are correct depending on your perspective. Another common concern is that there are too many phrasal verbs to learn. Well, the good news is that you don't need to learn them all. In fact, it's literally impossible. So maybe that's bad news. I don't know. But the point is, you can't learn them all. I don't know them all, and I'm a native speaker. Let me give you an example of something that happened to me recently. The other day, I was watching a YouTube video of a person from the UK, and he said, "My brother and I get on quite well." I said to myself, what's get on? But I knew what he meant from the context. It was clear he was saying that he has a good relationship with his brother. So I looked it up in the dictionary, and there it was. That's when I realized, oh, so in this context, get on in British English is the same thing as get along in American English. So just remember that even native speakers never stop learning different ways to use English. Now, I have some great news for you this time. Research shows that 1/3, or about 33% of all the phrasal verbs we use consist of only 25 phrasal verbs. And it gets even better. The top 100 phrasal verbs are about 50% of all the phrasal verbs used by native speakers. So if you can memorize the top 100, or just the top 25, and all of their meanings, of course, then wow, think of how many doors you can unlock for yourself.
Okay, I can handle that.
Here's a little secret. All of the phrasal verbs that I use in today's lesson are on the list of the top 100 phrasal verbs. I'll share the link to the paper down below if you'd like to see the data for yourself. The last misconception, and the most serious one, is that phrasal verbs are completely random, they don't make sense, and they can only be memorized. If you've ever felt this way before, I completely understand why. And it's not your fault. It's really a flaw in the way that phrasal verbs are taught in textbooks and schools. In fact, when I was an instructor at a local college, other teachers told me that they didn't want to teach the advanced level classes because they didn't know how to teach phrasal verbs. It's a systematic problem that really affects the way that both English learners and teachers feel about phrasal verbs. You're afraid to learn them, and we're afraid to teach them sometimes. However, if you pay attention to the particles, you'll realize that there are some very useful patterns that can help you figure out the meaning of new phrasal verbs when you encounter them. For example, one of the ways to use the word on is to describe two things that attach or make contact. We already know that you put on clothes, so if you're watching a video of someone trying on a new shirt, you can make a connection. Okay, so try on is a phrasal verb. If you put something on to see how it looks, or to see if you like it, then you are trying it on. This is why it's so much more efficient to learn phrasal verbs based on the particle. Particles are actually quite interesting because they are a reflection of how we think and how we perceive the space around us. If you'd like to watch a lesson about phrasal verbs with specific particles like on or over or up to help you make stronger logical connections, leave a comment and I might make a lesson like that in the future. So the main point of today's lesson is phrasal verbs are just words. Remember that when it comes to learning phrasal verbs, or normal verbs, or adjectives, or English in general, you have to put in a lot of effort, be patient, and most importantly, enjoy the process. If this lesson was useful and you'd like to see more, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share this lesson with other English learners. Again, you can find the link to the free PDF worksheet in the description. I'm Gina, and you can learn more about me and my lessons at yourworldinenglish.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye!